You wake up tired, even after 8 hours of sleep, and you tell yourself it is just another demanding season of life. Your calendar is full, your inbox is relentless, and the expectations placed on your shoulders feel heavier than ever before. In midlife, success often looks impressive from the outside, yet internally it can feel like a constant uphill climb. Leadership roles expand, financial commitments solidify, children grow into adolescents with complex needs. Aging parents begin to depend on you in new and unsettling ways. The professional summit you worked decades to reach suddenly feels like a narrow ridge with no guardrails. This is the stage where pressure peaks, and few people talk honestly about the cost. Stress in midlife professionals is not merely emotional discomfort. It is a biological event unfolding beneath conscious awareness. Every looming deadline and performance evaluation activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the central stress response system designed for short bursts of survival. Cortisol surges to mobilize energy, sharpen focus, and prepare the body for action. In acute moments, this system is adaptive and life-preserving. However, when activation becomes chronic, when emails replace predators and quarterly reports replace physical threats, cortisol remains elevated for far longer than nature ever intended. The body does not distinguish between a charging animal and an unstable market. It responds the same way, over and over again. Sustained cortisol elevation begins to alter the architecture of the brain. Dopamine signaling, which governs motivation, pleasure, and reward learning, becomes disrupted. The very neurochemical system that once allowed you to feel satisfaction after achievement gradually loses sensitivity. Wins feel muted. Milestones feel flat. The promotion you chased for years produces only a brief flicker of relief before the next demand arrives. Executive control, housed largely in the prefrontal cortex, also weakens under chronic stress. Decision-making becomes more reactive. Patience thins. Long-term thinking narrows into short-term survival strategies. Without realizing it, you begin operating from depletion rather than inspiration. Burnout emerges from this neurobiological terrain. It is not simply feeling tired or bored. It is a measurable psychological and physiological condition defined by emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and a reduced sense of accomplishment. Emotional exhaustion manifests as a persistent sense that you have nothing left to give. Depersonalization creates distance between you and the people you serve, transforming colleagues and clients into tasks rather than human beings. Reduced accomplishment erodes confidence, even when objective performance remains high. Burnout quietly reshapes identity. You no longer recognize the driven, optimistic professional you once were. Instead, you move through your days on autopilot, conserving energy wherever possible. At the same time, the demands of midlife amplify vulnerability. Career pressure intensifies precisely when personal responsibilities expand. Mortgage payments, tuition savings, retirement planning, and healthcare costs converge into a financial ecosystem that feels non-negotiable. You cannot simply walk away. The stakes appear too high. Performance becomes synonymous with stability. Any decline in productivity feels threatening, not just to ego but to family security. This perceived lack of escape reinforces stress, keeping the HPA axis chronically activated. In this environment, the brain searches for relief. When dopamine signaling is blunted and cortisol remains elevated, substances can begin to appear deceptively functional. Alcohol may promise relaxation after a long day. Stimulants may seem to sharpen focus during extended work hours. Sedatives may offer the illusion of restorative sleep. What starts as occasional assistance can gradually evolve into habitual coping. The brain, seeking equilibrium, learns quickly. Relief becomes reinforcement. Reinforcement becomes repetition. And repetition quietly lays the groundwork for dependence, often long before anyone recognizes the pattern. What makes this stage of life so dangerous is not weakness, but competence, because high-performing professionals are extraordinarily skilled at functioning while depleted. They meet deadlines, lead teams, close deals, and maintain appearances, all while their internal reward circuitry is misfiring. From the outside, nothing appears broken. Inside, however, a subtle recalibration is taking place. Dopamine receptors, repeatedly exposed to both chronic stress and artificial stimulation, begin to downregulate. The baseline for pleasure shifts. Ordinary experiences lose their vitality. Conversations feel transactional. Vacations feel too short. Even meaningful achievements fail to generate lasting satisfaction. The brain adapts to overload by numbing itself, and that numbing is often misinterpreted as maturity or resilience. This is where the science becomes deeply personal. Research explored by physicians such as Anna Lemke demonstrates that the brain operates on a balance between pleasure and pain. Every dopamine spike is counterbalanced by a corresponding dip. When substances artificially elevate dopamine, the brain compensates by tipping toward discomfort once the stimulus fades. Over time, the pleasure response weakens while the pain response strengthens. In practical terms, the drink that once relaxed you now requires a larger quantity to achieve the same effect. The stimulant that once enhanced productivity begins to disrupt sleep and increase anxiety. The sedative that once provided rest starts to erode natural sleep architecture. The brain's attempt to maintain equilibrium, paradoxically, deepens the imbalance. Midlife professionals are uniquely vulnerable because they often rationalize substance use as strategic optimization rather than emotional escape. A glass of wine becomes a networking tool. A prescription stimulant becomes a productivity enhancer. A sleep aid becomes an investment in performance. The narrative remains one of control. Yet beneath that narrative, neuroadaptation progresses silently. Cortisol remains elevated from unrelenting responsibility. Dopamine signaling remains dysregulated from repeated artificial surges. Executive control weakens further under sleep deprivation and emotional fatigue. What began as coping gradually transforms into dependency, not through recklessness, but through incremental reinforcement. The most unsettling aspect is that burnout and substance reliance can coexist with outward success for years. Promotions continue. Salaries increase. Social media displays curated images of achievement. Internally, however, motivation narrows to avoidance of discomfort rather than pursuit of purpose. You are no longer chasing excellence. You are managing distress. The brain's reward system becomes less responsive to intrinsic satisfaction and more responsive to immediate relief. This shift alters decision-making in subtle ways. Long-term health risks feel abstract compared to short-term alleviation of tension. Ethical compromises may appear easier to justify when exhaustion clouds judgment. Relationships strain as irritability replaces patience. And here lies the suspense that few anticipate. The very substances used to manage stress intensify the biological conditions that produce the stress in the first place. Alcohol disrupts sleep cycles, impairing restorative deep sleep and increasing next-day cortisol. Stimulants elevate sympathetic nervous system activity, compounding the body's stress load. Sedatives can blunt emotional processing, preventing natural recovery from psychological strain. Each attempt to recalibrate the system adds another layer of dysregulation. The brain's stress and reward circuits become increasingly intertwined, forming a feedback loop that tightens gradually. At some point, the professional who once thrived on challenge begins to experience diminishing returns. Work requires more effort for less satisfaction. Recovery requires more substance for less relief. Identity, once anchored in competence and drive, starts to feel fragile. The question that surfaces quietly, often late at night, is not whether the schedule is too full, but whether the current trajectory is sustainable. The realization can be disorienting because it threatens the very narrative of strength and achievement that defined adulthood. Yet within that discomfort lies an opportunity, one that demands courage, self-examination, and a willingness to confront the neurochemical truth beneath the performance. The turning point begins with awareness, because understanding the neurobiology of stress dismantles the illusion that willpower alone is the solution. When you recognize that chronic activation of the HPA axis has reshaped dopamine signaling. You stop interpreting exhaustion as a personal failure and begin seeing it as a physiological signal. Insight restores agency. The brain is plastic, meaning it can recalibrate when given consistent conditions of regulation. Cortisol levels can normalize. Dopamine receptors can regain sensitivity. Executive function can strengthen. However, this restoration does not occur through another quick intervention or artificial boost. It requires deliberate recalibration of the stress-reward balance that has drifted out of alignment. Science-backed regulation strategies operate on this principle. Sleep becomes non-negotiable, not as indulgence, but as neurological maintenance. Deep, consistent sleep reduces cortisol, repairs synaptic connections, and restores prefrontal control over impulsive behavior. Physical movement, especially aerobic exercise, increases baseline dopamine and endorphin tone without triggering the extreme spikes associated with substances. Mindfulness practices strengthen the anterior cingulate cortex and improve emotional regulation, allowing stress to be processed rather than suppressed. Structured digital boundaries reduce continuous microstressors that keep the nervous system in a low-grade state of activation. These interventions may appear simple, yet their cumulative neurochemical effect is profound. Equally important is the intentional reintroduction of discomfort. The brain's pleasure-pain balance recalibrates when it is allowed to experience mild, manageable stress without artificial relief. Short periods of abstinence from substances reset dopamine tone. Cold exposure, disciplined exercise, and focused work intervals teach the nervous system that discomfort is survivable and transient. This builds resilience at the receptor level. The concept articulated by clinicians such as Dr. Anna Lemke emphasizes that leaning into controlled hardship can restore equilibrium more effectively than chasing comfort. The paradox is that sustainable well-being often requires temporary restraint. Preventive strategy in midlife also demands structural reflection. High-performing professionals must reassess workload distribution, delegation practices, and identity attachment to productivity. Burnout thrives when self-worth is fused exclusively with output. Diversifying identity through relationships, creativity, service, and community engagement strengthens intrinsic reward pathways. When fulfillment expands beyond professional validation, the dopamine system receives varied, sustainable input. This reduces reliance on substances as the primary means of modulation. Financial planning, boundary setting, and realistic performance expectations further decrease chronic stress activation. These are not signs of retreat. They are strategic recalibrations designed to protect long-term cognitive and emotional capacity. There is a deeper philosophical shift embedded in this transformation. Midlife is not merely a peak of responsibility, it is an inflection point of consciousness. It confronts you with the limits of perpetual acceleration. The body signals when the pace is incompatible with longevity. Listening to those signals is not weakness, but wisdom. By addressing stress at its neurochemical roots, you reclaim authorship over your trajectory. You move from reactive coping to proactive design. You choose sustainable excellence over frantic endurance. Recovery and prevention do not demand perfection. They require consistency, humility, and the courage to interrupt patterns before they calcify into pathology. When you regulate stress intentionally, restore natural dopamine balance, and cultivate multidimensional identity, you transform vulnerability into strength. The professional demands of midlife do not disappear, but your relationship to them changes. Pressure becomes information rather than threat. Achievement becomes meaningful rather than compulsory. Energy becomes renewable rather than borrowed from tomorrow. If you are benefiting from our topics, please subscribe, like, and turn on the bell notification so you can see our new videos early.